Fairies through the ages. The history of the Fae.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Obviously I've got my dogs here, so you'll have to excuse any snoring, etc. The Victorian era we are on now, fairies through the ages. And there was some particular fairy paintings that were noted in the era by Richard Dadd of the fairy folk with a sinister and malign tone, might I add. The Victorian flower fairies were popularised in part by Queen Mary's interest in fairy art by the British illustrator and poet Cicely Mary Barkers. There was a series of books published from 1923 to 1948. The image of fairies, of course, in literature, over time became much prettier and obviously smaller too. The rise of spiritualism influenced an interest in all mystical things. The spiritualism theory began in the United States in 1848 and moved to Britain in 1852. Spiritualists believed in the preservation of the soul after death and that the soul continues to exist in the physical world. One of the pioneers celebrating elemental type beings is Paracelsus, obviously. There was also Madame Blavatsky, who established the Theosophical Society. She was quite big in that. I think that was the 1870s. It was through Victorian Edwardian era that there was a heightened increase in the interest of fairies. The Victorians concerned themselves with the promoting of the origins and the serious study of supernatural creatures, a quest for explanations. They wanted to know where they were from. They wanted people to believe in them, why people believed in them. They wanted religious, scientific, and historical belief. In 1846, William John Thomas, who contributed to the term folklore in the English language, commented, this was in the Athenaeum, that belief in fairies is by no means extinct in England. And by late 1880s, folklorists were examining oral testimony on the nature and the customs of the little folk. And obviously the historical and archaeological remains left by them. Whether they found any, I'm not sure, I'm not really. I know that there has been some come up, but I think it's best if you research that because I'm not sure on that. I mean, they have said there has been, and then it's been denied, and I think it goes backwards and forwards with that all the time. The actual Theosophical Society included fairies in their system, but it wasn't until the later 19th century that a system came into play, and it's the same system, what we see today. It's largely still prevalent today, to be exact. They considered that fairies were elementals and of a different nature to human beings. They thought they had a different density, they were beyond the range of normal senses, but they also believed that certain people were sensitive enough to see them. And they also introduced the idea that many children were able to see fairies. They discovered fairies as frequently seen playing with flowers or being among hummingbirds. So, according to the Theosophic fairies, they're not from the same line as humans, and they are definitely not of our evolution, according to this theory, but have been animated from grasses and cereals in the vegetable kingdom. And finally, they evolved into what we know as the tiny nature spirits, of course. Then, after that, we have the theory of the elemental types, the element types. They have astral bodies, not physical ones, and they pass through different stages of the kingdom of angels. And then we have the elemental beings of thought form. They come, they do work, but once the work's done, they dissipate and they vanish. But in reality, the Theosophy theory always keeps the fairies close with nature connections, flower colouring, seed protection, distribution, crops, the dying of things and the rebirth, woodlands, berries, meadows, and all that stuff. By codepending with humans to improve the cultivation of cereal, flowers, and fruits. These fairies would communicate by gestures, and the relationship between human and fairies was said to be one similar to pets. They were hostile sometimes, but they could respond to emotion, and they did appreciate attention, but not in a way that we see attention. It was more as in gifting the crops that they grew or gifting the seeds. It was more that kind of attention, or giving them a job. That was better attention for them, not patting their head and stuff. Not like that. The Celtic revival cast fairies as part of Ireland's cultural heritage, and those involved in this belief brought about political and cultural necessity. William Butler Yeats, for example, reported on his interactions with the Sihi, the Irish fairies, and wrote repeatedly of their nature and their behaviour. There was a common assumption that the truth of fairy existence could and would be discovered by some sort of scientific or verifiable means. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a revival of older themes in fantasy literature. The story of the origin of fairies appearing in a chapter about Peter Pan, and then in the J.M. Barrie's 1902 novel, The Little Bird, Barrie wrote, "When the first baby laughed for the first time, his laugh broke into a million pieces, and they all went skipping about. That was the beginning of fairies." And obviously those influences and these influences that we've just been through, they led to a big story regarding fairies, and that is the Cottaginlia fairies. It's those ones. Sorry guys for a delivery. Forgive me for that. So the Cottingley fairies, Francis Griffiths and the fairies, July 1917. In 1917, Frances Griffiths, 9 years old, and her mother arrived from South Africa. They stayed at Frances' aunt Elsie Wright's mother in the village of Cottingley. I can't even pronounce that word, Cottingley in West Yorkshire. I'm terrible. Elsie was then 16. The two girls played together beside the beck and claimed to see fairies. Frances said later, "Elsie was working. I suppose I must have been daydreaming one day when I looked across the beck and saw a willow leaf twirling around rapidly, moving as if it were on its own. I did think it odd. There was no breeze. The leaf was being held by a little man. First time I saw the little man, he was about 18 inches high. He was walking purposefully down the bank on the willow side of the beck, holding a willow leaf in his hand." I have wrote this down, by the way, so I don't forget it. I'm not so daft to do that, because I would. He was twiddling it very fast as he crossed the water to the other side. Elsie borrowed her father's camera, and her father, Arthur Wright, he had his own dark room, and these photos were developed within that dark room. When he saw the pictures, he actually dismissed it as being figures, cardboard cutouts, but not real, obviously. 2 months later, the girls borrowed the camera again, and they returned to the father with the photos that were produced in the dark room, and it showed Elsie holding her hand out to a gnome. But Arthur again was convinced it was nothing more than a prank, and he refused to lend his camera to them again. In 1919, they became public. Polly Wright attended a meeting of the Theosophical Society in Bradford. Then they were displayed at the Society's annual conference in Harrogate a few months later, where they came to the attention of Edward Gardiner, who sent the prints, along with the original glass plate negatives, to, I think it was, who was it now? I forgot. I wrote it down. I think it was Harold Snelling, who considered the photos to be genuine. Or it could be, I know it was a H, and then the guy was named with a H, but I don't remember if it was a Harold or a Hart or something like that. Anyway, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who we all know, used them to illustrate an article on fairies that he'd been commissioned to write. And he was commissioned to write this, it was at Christmas time in one of the 1920 editions of the Strand magazine or something. Anyway, it sold out within a couple of days. Gardner and Doyle sought a second expert opinion from Kodak and the company's technicians. What's very odd is that Kodak actually said the pictures showed no signs of being faked, yet they would not issue a sticker of authenticity to the pictures. So why, I am not sure, but apparently it was then Ilford that reported there was evidence of fakery. In 1920s, Doyle and Gardner decided to meet the Wright family. Arthur Wright said he had searched the girls' bedrooms. He had looked all around the streams, he had looked everywhere and could find no cardboard cutouts and no incriminating evidence. Gardner returned on a second visit. When he came, he had 2 cameras and 24 secretly marked photographs. The girl took several photographs. 2 of those photographs appeared to show fairies, but only 2 out of them, obviously. So Gardner then made a final visit to the Cottingley. I can't pronounce Cottingley. Somebody's gonna need to help me with that one. In August 1921, but there were no more photographs. He was accompanied then, though, by a clairvoyant named Geoffrey Hodson, and although neither Frances nor Elsie claimed to see any fairies, Hodson said he saw them everywhere. Frances moved to Scarborough in the 1920s, and Elsie eventually emigrated to the USA, where she married. Frances married a soldier in 1928, and she finally settled in Ramsgate. In 1966, Cottingley fairy story subsided. The Daily Express newspaper tracked Elsie down, and she returned to England after living abroad, so they tracked her down when she actually returned to England. She did an interview as well, and she admitted in the interview that the fairies may have been figments of her imagination, suggesting she somehow caught her thoughts on the photographs. BBC's nationwide programme investigated the case in 1971, but Elsie stuck to her story. September of 1976, Austin Mitchell, for the Yorkshire television programme, interviewed both women. They agreed a rational person doesn't see fairies, but denied the photos were fabricated. In 1978, magician and skeptic James Randi, along with a team from the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, examined the photos and concluded they were fake, and that strings could be seen supporting the fairies. Geoffrey Crawley, editor of the British Journal of Photography, also examined the photographs and concluded they were fakes. In 1982, and 1912 to 1983. There was an article that was published. I think it was 1983 the article was actually published, though. Before that there was talks and this and that. But Elsie and Frances admitted in an article published in the magazine the unexplained pictures had been faked, although they both really had seen fairies. Elsie took illustrations from Princess Mary's book and she drew wings on them, cutting out cardboard figures and supporting them with hat pins. Frances, however, maintained the fifth was real. Frances died in 1986 and Elsie in 1988. The glass photographic plates were bought for £6,000 by an unnamed buyer at a London auction held in 2001. Frances's daughter appeared in an episode of the Antiques Roadshow 2009 with the photographs and one of the cameras given the girls by Doyle. She told the expert that she believed that the fairies in the fifth photo were genuine. The first edition of Frances' memoirs was published a few months later under the title Reflections on the Cottingley Fairies. And that's the story. So as you can see, it changed a lot through time, didn't it? But I am going to pop some photos on for you to look at anyway. Not my photos, they're photos from Cottingley Fairies. The 19th century to early 20th century, farmers did believe in spirits of land and water, and they believed they could affect the growth of crops. They could feed the land and keep the crops ongoing and healthy. Very strong evidence in Ireland, England, and the rest of Western Europe that regular offerings were made to fairies to prevent them from doing harm. When things went wrong, people would call in a wise woman, a cunning man, or fawn people, or shamans, fairy doctors, witches, basically. These people were believed to have special gifts, knew how to see the fairies, but they could also travel into that realm and back and gain knowledge so that they could take it back to the farmers and tell them what needed to be done to put things right. In Scotland and parts of northern England, near the Scottish border, beliefs remained in elves, and it was very prominent still into the 19th century, because if you remember when we first started, there was just elves, and then dwarfs and elves, and it's only through time that things changed. So way back in medieval times, there was just the elves and the dwarfs, and then obviously things definitely changed as time went along, and there were more and more fairies coming out, different names for them and such, I guess. So the 20th and the 21st century, look at 1927, the Fairy Investigation Society was founded in London by Quinton Crawford, a retired naval scientist who believed he had been successful in communicating with the dead and fairies by radio. The society met regularly, discussing fairy matters, carried out experiments too. After a brief intermission, the Second World War, the society was revived. One of its most famous members was Walt Disney. The society believed in the reality of fairies and sought to accumulate knowledge about them and classify the order of nature spirits. They focused on compelling evidence in the form of letters and obviously popular accounts of interaction with fairies, of sightings with fairies. They considered that seeing fairies was possibly a clairvoyant ability and that fairies could connect people to nature, as well as opening the human soul to a higher metaphysical world. The experiments that they did appeared to involve fairy science with a radio set, and automatic writing. Marjorie Johnston of the FIS compiled numerous accounts of encounters with fairies, mainly collected in the 1950s, which was published as Fairies, Authentic Reports of Fairies in Modern Times. There are numerous pagan groups that profess a belief in fairies. Neo-pagan fairy faith sprung from the Wiccan community around the 1970s in California. It's a tradition that branched from one to another, and it's old tradition, and it's through the work of Mark Roberts and his High Priestess. The distinguishing characteristics of fairy faith is the use of the Celtic tree calendar by Robert Graves. I've actually got one of those, but never actually used it, but I do have one. I don't know why I've got it though. I don't know where it came from. So in his book, The White Goddess, I think it's 1948, in Fairy Faith, there were lessons that were associated with each lunar month, students' experiences, personal transformations in connection with each tree. Fairy Wicca is a tradition of modern Wicca that places an emphasis on fairies of any type, their law, relationship to the natural world and the other world. And from the 1960s, folklorists began to study fairy folklore with great length and depth. They looked at the negative as well as the positive. They looked at all the different representations of fairies. It became an academic interest and was echoed by an increase in interest among artists and writers from the 1970s onwards, and the representations began to return their folklore back to its roots. So, current century, many pagans assert a belief in fairies and other similar spirits as a component of their wider belief system. Others make fairy spirits the central aspect of their religion. From November 2014 to November 2017, the Fairy Census, an international online survey, was carried out to investigate modern beliefs in fairies. The census examined 88 fairy experiences of English-speaking children aged from 3 to 10 from the last 80 years. Looking at the characteristics of fairy sightings among the young, the vast majority were female. The census found that there were different models in the backgrounds of the reported encounters, with some conforming to traditional descriptions and others were more theosophical, like the nature spirits, of course. Then they were categorised themselves. So they would take the fairy sightings and they'd sort of make them their own and change them quite a lot through time. I guess they have changed a lot if we look at it anyway, which is really interesting. So if we take a look at something that they would write down would be there were 2 or 3 fae. One was taller and one was shorter. One was the same size. They shimmered in the light, so I couldn't see their faces, but it was obvious they were wearing strange clothing. And then there were 5, small, 4 to 5 inches tall, feminine, winged, soft colours, pearly and opal-like. That's what someone else saw. So there's been a connection anyway made between these balls of light, obviously, and fairies, and it's sometimes said that the fairy lights actually carry souls, or they are souls, what we know as of orbs, I guess. And it's the fairies of the elements that become the balls of light. So there's so many variations, so many. In modern popular culture, fairies have sometimes become personifications of the goddess and beauty, not creatures to be feared. but belief in them is firmly associated with children. And belief is vast as well, and the various encounters, they change. It changes so much, through time. It really, really does. But if we're going to look at like fantasy and fairy tale type things, I mean, the word fairy tale, contes de fées, is French. Madame d'Aulnoy, late 17th century. That's where it comes from, fairy tale. And some tales, they do go back actually thousands of years. I mean, we call them fairy tales now, but they weren't being called that back then. They were considered to be a separate genre. Now they're more fantasy genre, I think, rather than fairy tales. Like, if you look at Tolkien's The Hobbit, you'll find it in fantasy, not in fairy tale. As in the fact that fairy tales were born from oral tradition of storytelling from generation to generation, which is just not done anymore as much. The first famous Western fairy tale are those of the and it's Aesop of ancient Greece, and that's BCE, 6th century BC. It's quite old. But the elements in early modern literature from Chaucer's Canterbury resurfaced in Western literature from the 16th and 17th century and became popular among the aristocratic women in France. Among the tales told in that time were the Charles Perrault in 1697 fixed the forms of like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, and he rewrote them. I'm sure that's what it were, guys, that rewrote them, because they go back quite a long time, like really, really long. The 18th century was the first period in which fiction was written expressively for children. French fairy tales were translated to English because they were French, that's where fairy tale came from. And they became popular, but the one that did become the first sort of collection that was popular is obviously the Brothers Grimm, who collected German fairy tales from 1812 to 1815. In later editions, the writings have been rewrote, and many of the tales have had to be changed to make them acceptable to society. This is because the original fairy tales had sex and violence in them, and obviously that could not be in them for children. So the Brothers Grimm did actually reject fairy tales that derived from Perrault in the view that they were French. The Grimm really only wanted the Hans Christian Andersen continued the tradition of German literacy, I guess. And they wanted to draw on the old folklore, not, they didn't want the new. The fairy tales contain many common elements. They come from a variety of locations, but many are very distant from each other. Suggestions say that fairy tales may be ancient, like Beauty and the Beast, Rumpelstiltskin. They actually appear over 4,000 years ago, which is an extremely long time, isn't it? But that being said, like I said, they were altered for this century. The sort of common fairy tales and its origins is completely different to what we see now. They had sex references quite a lot in there. They had violence, and the violence was particularly increased violence. So they changed it to be a contemporary literature and use the form of fairy tales, which is now in the other category of fantasy, and that's where it is today. If you're looking for tales of fairies, etc., you're more than likely going to find it in the fantasy section now, and not actual fairy tales. But even the Brothers Grimm had to change some of their work slightly over time because it was that gruesome, so it is believed. And yeah, so that's my ramblings done for today, guys. But I do hope that you enjoyed it, and at least we're able to take something from it. As you can see, things change rapidly through time, and they're on and off, and they change, and then they're twisted around, and there's so much happens over time. Things just get lost, if you get what I mean. They get muddled and mixed up. It's like Chinese whispers, I guess. But love and light, guys. Thank you. The next part of sort of fairies through the ages, we're going to look at the various type of beings and why. And the things I'm going to read, some of them are very odd because they are Old English, so they don't make any sense, but yeah. So it's often said that the fae are no more, and with them left all the happiness. The fairies are from a golden age. Geoffrey Chaucer's wife of Bath's Tale, 1387 to 1400, said that the wife declared that her tale was set long ago in the days of King Arthur. Now I'm going to read it in how it's wrote in Old English, but then I'm going to read it properly, don't worry, so don't panic. Of whom the Britons spake with great honour in the old days of King Arthur. All was this land fulfilled of fair air. The elf queen with her jolly compagnie danced full after in many a grand meadow. This was the old opinion as I read it. I speak of many 100 years ago, but now can no man, so none else more. That's, yeah. So, of which that Britons speak great honour, that in the olden days of King Arthur, all this land was filled with fairy. The elf queen with her jolly company often danced in many a green meadow. This was the old opinion as I read. I speak of many 100 years ago, but no man can see elves any more. That's what it translates to. Obviously, the Old English is just atrocious. I'm not going to be reading it in that, even though it's written like that. It kind of just, that's why I translate it from Nancy. If it's not written in code, it's written in Old English. That's what she will like. Sometimes even different languages, and it all just higgledy-piggledy. In The Faithful Shepherdess of 1608, John Fletcher wrote, methinks there are no goblins, and methinks merits talk that in these woods the nimble fairies walk our fables. The early 19th century, Thomas Hood wrote, song lyrics, fairies have broke their wands, and wishing has lost its power. Fairies have broke their wands, and wishing has lost its power. In the early 19th century, in 1906, Rudyard Kipling had the fairies say in Puck of Poots Hills. So I think it was writings, but I can't translate it properly, but I think it's some sort of writing regarding Puck of Pooks Hills. The people of the hills have all left. I saw them come into old England, and I saw them go. Giants, trolls, kelpies, brownies, goblins, imps, wood, tree, mound and water spirits, health people, hill watchers, treasure guards, good people, little people, the pishagwes, the leprechauns, the night rides, the pixies and nixies, gnomes, and the rest, gone, all gone. Beginning of the 19th century, Hugh Miller recorded what was supposed to be the final departure of fairies from Scotland, at the burn of Ithi. Alternative spirituality has contributed to keeping the faith alive. Obviously, the 20th century modern paganism and New Age movement also kept them alive, but the word fairy actually dates back to around 1300. It come from the actual Latin word for fatum. Fatum meaning fate, meaning destiny. And then it came from also, if we look at it on a whole, fata, the fates, which obviously is the fates. But then it ended up being in Old French, fae, F-A-E. Then it went to F-E-Y, or F-A-Y, and then later F-A-E-R-I-E. And then the word suffrere was altered to a word that meant a place or something found in an area of enchantment, and then that sort of became fairy. But the way that it was spelt was extremely controversial because it changed that many times. However, obviously now it don't matter how we write it, we do know what we're writing about. But back then it went through many changes. So we have the F-A-Y-R-I-E, the F-A-I-R-I-E, the F-A-Y-E-R-Y-E, and F-A-R-I-E, yep. Folklore of southern and eastern England, fairies became known as actual frères, and then there were fairies, and then faristas, and then Pharisees, and then Pharisees, all spelt differently. But the word originated from the Fia Sihi. It may not have been pronounced like that. Obviously, as you know, it's Sihi is not pronounced how it's spelled anyway because it's S-I-D-H-E-A-N at this time. But Fia is wrote F-E-A-R, but even though it's wrote Fia Sihi, it's actually Fair Sheen of Irish gods. So they've been through quite a few name changes along the way. In the past, fairies were heroic. They were human size. They became small with wings, obviously, for children's books as we went into the early 17th century. It is said that they lived in splendour, luxury, and were known as fair folk, still folk, the good neighbours, the good folk, the Sealy Court, Sihi as we know it, the strangers, and also the, what was the other one now? They were known as something else, fine folk, that was it. But the word fairy is basically a synonym for similar beings, that's what it means. And this means including sprite, pixie, elf, hop, imp, brownie, puck. It covers a whole range of supernatural beings. However, it does not take mermaids, angels, devils, demons, or ghosts into context with it. It is just a form of saying familiar beings. Away with the Fairies describes being completely mad or distracted and in a dream world, and that's me. I'm completely mad and distracted in a dream world, so I'm both. A figurative adjective use of fairy relates to lightness, fineness, and delicacy. The slang definitive meaning is actually, this is back in the 1870s. It's the affirmative for male homosexual, which first appeared in the 1870s, was commonly understood by the 1890s. The term fairy godmother dates back to about 1820, and there is a sea fossil or a sea urchin, fossilized urchin, found on the English downlands, and they were called fairy loaves or loaves. 18th century English called the stones of old Roman roads fairy paths. They would say that those old Roman roads were actually the fairy paths in which everybody seeked. Obviously, as time went by, you can no longer actually see them because they got covered up and things overtook them and whatever else, as you know. Now, although there's numerous ways of spelling fairy and such, they have been classified into more simpler terms, and they classified them into two. And this was the trooping fairies. They were social. They were matriarchal. They had a world. They travelled. They had a race living in fairyland. They had a structure that was basically human. It was like we live. It was close to us. And then you have the solitary, which they don't really. They can be okay with socialization, but they're not. They're not as well with it as the trooping fairies. They don't mind being mischievous and causing harm, but generally they can attach themselves to a family, and they can demonstrate being okay, but generally they are sort of wild at nature, the wild at heart. The elf indicates a separate being, and the word elf is regional. It was used rather than fairy in the lowlands of Scotland, but by the end of the medieval period, it had been supplemented for fairy. But elf differs only because they are young and mischievous. Elf Germanic law meant white being. This was in old texts as it associates elves with the gods of Norse mythology, with magic, beauty, seduction, and illness. Scandinavian put them into two classes, light and dark elves. Light were like the troops of England. The Germanic elf was a cognate of the Latin albus. Now this means matte white, but I know that albus just means white in Latin, so I'm not sure why it would put matte white, but that's what it meant. Elves, they could be good or bad, but they were mainly seen as being more mischievous, but not to be trusted. Lots of them were believed to be female and had an overpowering beauty that was able to ensnare and trick men. The English elf from Old English word is very different because it's elf, which plead elf. So yeah, it was pronounced, it's just very different, really different. Then there was a different one used for female elves as well, such as elfrey. But during the Middle English period, the word elf, it became routine and revolutionary as being something that would include more female beings than it would male beings, which I don't understand because honestly, I think in general they are probably equal, You'll find that the word elf occasionally appears in Old English names. For example, a survivor of these sort of names is Alfred, which was from Elfred Bison. The clearest example of elf, because it's quite similar, is the Elvedern, Elves on a Hill, Suffolk. Not sure what that means, but Elvedon is a place, but apparently was also well known. They would call people Elvedon. An Old English plural in Beowulf was more of for an ethnic group rather, but it was suggested that elves were seen as people. When all said and done, that's what it suggested. It suggested that elves were seen as people, even though they were mischievous. They were believed to have always took the side of humans in certain circumstances. They could cause harm and they could be dangerous. They were sort of like human beings, so they did become, what's the word, sometimes enticed by humans, I guess, to do things that they wouldn't normally do, and that kind of makes sense. And if you look at the medieval sort of romance traditions of fairies, it would be quite a lot of them would look like elves, and there would be a sort of queen, and they would seduce and rape in the stories, believe it or not. And there's a lot that were left out of these stories that never ever came to light because of such circumstances of what they did. Now, they can also be shapeshifters like any other fae. They were young and beautiful when they were females. The males generally old and described like being sort of babies born with particular birthmarks. They would call these babies elf-touched or marked deformity, elf-marked basically. They were mischievous, they were pranksters, and they were strange. They could also make strange occurrences happen as well, and things in the house would start working on their own, things go on and off, and this was said to be because you had an elf marked in your home, which would be a baby with a birthmark, basically. The Icelandic folklore elves, they are now hidden people, which I think is Huljufolk. Yeah. The folk tales are said to be large, but apparently they are quite big beings. They have a big build. They dress in grey, they have black hair, and they live in mounds in Icelandic folklore. The 12th century Anglo-Saxon elves were quite small. They could be invisible. They were demonic beings. However, they were actually seen as people. This has only been recently suggested in certain scholarship writings that have been found that they weren't what they were originally described as, but actually they were more treated like people because they acted and looked like people. Yet there is some suggestion that says that that's not true. So there's the controversy around it's quite odd because these writings about the elves not being demonic and being a part of the race has only just come to light quite recently. And I don't know them fully yet, but I'll see if I can get back to that one. The most famous known elves are those with Santa, and no, they don't look like that. This image was popularised through magazines in the mid-19th century. The tradition kind of originates to 1823. There was a poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, known as the night before Christmas, obviously. St. Nicholas is described as a right jolly old elf, and his helpers become known as Santa's helpers. Obviously now they are the little green-suited elves. Elves are not like that at all. And then they were popularised in fantasy fiction by sort of the King of Elflands. That was a 1924 novel by Lord Dunsany. So this, and yeah, I think there were Tolkien's, weren't there, as well, Lord of the Rings, first published in 1954 to 1955, and now it's been redone again, obviously. And the elves in there have sort of brought this more fantasy, but more popular version of elves, I guess. Now, the elves did speak an elvish language, and they were said to be of fantasy, yet no human characteristics. However, as you can see, things have changed quite a lot. In the fantasy role-playing games, they may not look like us, and in the novels, they don't look like us, but they tend to be beautiful, more so than humans. They tend to be more gifted, more skilled in just science, in learning. Their senses are better, they are skilled archers, and they have pointed ears. So again, even though they have changed, they are still quite generic in the way that they are put forward. So then we have the pixie, sometimes the pigsy, pisky as well. Yeah, I don't know why pixie though, it's a weird one. The Devon equivalent of the Cornish pisky or pesky. There's no clear etymology for the word pixie. It predates Christianity presence in Britain. In the Christian era, pixies were the souls of unbaptized babies children that died, and their appearance would change to pixies, and their clothing was placed in a clay funeral pot, used in their earthly lives as toys. Yeah, that's odd. By 1869, some were suggesting that pixie was a racial remnant of Pictic tribes who used to point and tattoo their skin blue. An attribute often given to pixies, however, is there is no proven connection, and the etymological connection is very doubtful. The Cornish piskie is older, more wizened, and meagre than the sturdy, earthy pixie of Somerset. They are white and they are very slight, like thin. They are generally naked. They inhabit ancient underground places. They do relate to ancestral sites where they are known to hang around, such like the stone circles and such, burrows, things like that. Ring forts. They tend to go back there because they see something in that as being a connection to ancestral knowledge or whatever. Pixies generally are benign but are mischievous. They're short and childlike. They're fond of dancing, tend to gather outdoors, and there tend to be a huge number of them. They will dance or wrestle through the night, usually wear green, and often have red hair. Dartmoor legends, pixies disguise themselves as bundle of rags to lure children to play. Although sometimes helpful to normal humans, they also have a reputation for misleading travellers down the wrong path. And that's why we call it pixie-led. Yeah. In modern times, they're depicted as obviously these little pointy-eared beings wearing green and pointed hats. The traditional stories describe them as being in ragged bundles of rags, which obviously they will actually exchange for new clothes. They'll exchange gifts for new clothes because they want the new clothes. Then we have the Spriggan. This is a more refined type of mischievous Cornish fairy. The Spriggan is another way of confirming the piskie or pesky of Cornwall, and it's generally tiny but are believed to be the ghost of old giants. And although they are usually very small, they can swell to an enormous size. The bucker or buckers, bockles or knockers are, again, they are Cornish sprites, which again lead back to the Cornish peskies. They're all sort of the same thing. They are said to be the souls of the Jews who formerly worked in the mines of Cornwall. They're not allowed to rest because of their wicked practices as tinners, and they're kind of cursed. So they say that these helpful spirits of the people turned into the knockers that died in the mine accidents. A knocker is believed to be about 2 feet tall, dressed as a miner with a big head and long arms, a wrinkled face and white whiskers. The name from which it comes is because apparently the miners will knock on the walls just before caving. This is a way of, some people believe it's a way of them warning humans that something bad was going to happen and that they need to leave. However, there's others that say they were malevolent spirits, and the knocking was the sound of them hammering to cause the cave-in. So there again, you have two different stories. They were either warning you or they were trying to kill you. Either way, they were going to cave in. Then we go into Brownie, Hobgoblin, the Dobby, the Hobman, and the but butchered. Apologise, dog were knocking ball all over. I don't know why, because he's eaten like 3 balls already. I'm not refilling it. No. So brown is from Scotland, north and east of England, and into the Midlands in Wales. It's known as the Bawaka or the Baka. In the Highlands, Badok, and on the Isle of Man, it is known as the Venadore, Dobby, or Dobby. It may also refer to hobgoblin or puck. The border brownies are described as small men about 3 feet in height, raggedly dressed in brown clothes with brown faces and shaggy heads. They're sometimes said to have no nose or only holes, or actually only nostrils but no holes. In Aberdeenshire, it was sometimes believed that they had no separate fingers, a thumb and the other 4 joined like mittens. A brownie is a type of domestic fairy that spends the night coming out to do household tasks while all sleep. They like to be paid in milk, honey, porridge left out for them, but they don't want it to be seen as a gift, so you generally just leave it them. They do not like nicknames, they don't like clothes, and they do not like being thanked, and they don't like being cursed. So there's a lot of things that they don't like. A brownie, when it gets angry, is said to transform into a boggart, which is a hairy, ugly, dark little fay dressed in tattered clothes. Boggarts have oversized feet, it is believed, and they would cause small accidents and create nasty things as well as strange noises. When I say this, I'm talking blowing out candles, hiding tools, messing with equipment, making babies cry. They can be made to leave by giving them a name, because bogies are mischievous, but they're not harmless. They like to amuse themselves with pranks. They will pull blankets off bed, they will create cold spots, they kind of like moving things about. So what I'm saying is, you're looking at poltergeist type activity is generally a bogey or a boggart type deal, it is believed. So we have then puck or puka or fuka or polka. Wild race of forest fae. And they're able to change from forms to animal or human. They're not evil, but they are mischievous. They can appear as a tame pony. Now, this is where it can go a bit wrong, because in some tales the puck will turn into a pony and pretend to be tame, and then it will obviously take the person upon its back wherever, and it's called puck leaden, which means to be misled by a puck. In Midsummer Night's Dream, if you remember, there's a few in there, but there's also a fae that's described like a hobgoblin who is called Puck. So, you're all loving Shakespeare though. You just had to take notice. If you took notice, they're everywhere. Everywhere in Shakespeare, they're quite, yeah. The goblin or hobgoblin, a malicious, evil and grotesque, wicked goblin spirit. Small, but more correctly, a friendly spirit such as brownies. They're quite similar to that. They wear patched coats. They tend to have old man's face, but not all the time. They will help around the house. They work faster than people. Robin Goodfellow was the best known and most sort of referenced of hobgoblin of southern England of the 16th and 17th centuries. Hob may substitute for the start of his name, or may refer to hearth or the hob, so to speak. The earliest reference to Robin Goodfellow dates from 1531. There's older forms of sihi, and these are called the Ossi. The Irish term for a fairy race In Irish and Scottish mythology, obviously we know they were spelt differently to how they're pronounced. There's many euphemisms of them though. You know, good neighbours, little darlings, people of peace, little folk. This was something that they believed that you would call them, so not to offend them, you would call them fair folk or good neighbours, people of peace or little folk. They didn't want to insult them, but they also did not want to attract their attention, so they would try and keep things mutual, because they kind of feared them, but at the same time they didn't mind them, if that makes sense. So it wasn't that they wanted rid of them, it's just that they just wanted to be, you know, leave them to their devices and such, and they get on with theirs. The Aussie live underground in fairy mounds across the Western Sea, or in an invisible world that coexists with the world of humans. In modern Irish, the people of the mounds are also called Duenesihi, Denishi in Scotland. Also, I think it's Dacinsi, and they are ancestors, spirits of nature, goddesses or gods. Sihi were once the angels of heaven, cast down to earth, often living under water or underground. They were seen as heroic fairies who engaged the chivalry of life, and they were the first fairies associated with glamour. They were human-sized, beautiful beings, but they could be invisible too. Gaelic tales of the Ossi later, literally the versions changed later to the Tuatha the Dianon, the people of the goddess Danu, the deities of Irish mythology. Some sources describe them as survivors of the Tuatha de Danann. The fairies would be survivors of the Tuatha de Danann, who apparently sent them into the other world, yet the other part is that some say the Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, they came and they retreated with the Fae to the other world, and they appear in 11th century manuscripts as the earliest people who inhabited Ireland and Britain. So the Tuatha de Danann is in 11th century manuscripts as the earliest people who inhabited Ireland and Britain, yet no one actually knows where they came from, just of them. It's very bizarre, because it's believed that the Tuatha de Danann came from the water within mist. Strange. Then we have the leprechaun, Lucorpen, Lubracan, Leprechaun, Lepranon. There's many ways of pronouncing it throughout the ages, and it's part of the actual Ussie in Irish folklore. Usually small bearded men wearing coats and hats of green. They're mischievous, the solitary. They spend their time mending shoes, hiding gold at the rainbow, and if caught, 3 wishes are said to be granted before you give them their freedom. Before the 20th century, they wore red, not green. The earliest reference of a leprechaun appears in a medieval tale known as the Ecra Fergus Maclete, Adventures of Fergus son of Lete. The Sihi and Unsihi courts in Scottish folklore means happy, lucky, blessed. The Unsihi, obviously, its opposite, unhappy, misfortune, and unholy. The word itself comes from an Old English sigh. The English word silly is also derived from the root selly-wicked, which is Lowland Scot term for fairies. Sihis pursue and they aid humans. They will warn people, they will help people, but they will also say when humans have offended a particular fae and give them a chance to amend the wrong that's been done. Bear in mind this is for the leprechaun version, which in Ireland is seen as part of the Ossi, which be the Sihi, by the way. They are known for mischief. They are light-hearted though. They forgive sorrow swiftly. They sometimes fail to realise the effects their actions have, and they don't understand what they're actually doing, almost like a child. They do try and have human kindness, and they do try and reward humans too. If they are betrayed or offended, they will avenge. And of course, they will respond in quite a drastic way. Other names for Sihi, which are different in various, obviously, because we see the Sihi as something else than the Irish do, but Shining Throne, Golden Ones, Shining Ones, and Summer Court. The Unseelies or Unsihis are dark inclined and said to inflict misery and destructions on humans. However, it's really important to understand that they're not always malevolent, just as the Seelie are not always benevolent. Not so much evil, but simply don't trust humans. It's both courts do not like extreme dark magic. Low level magic and justice and things like that is completely different to complete dark magic. There has to be a reason behind it, and it has to be a justifiable reason. However, the Unseelie can get drawn in by dark magic and end up going down a dark path and need saving, as such, I guess is the word. But the Seelie, they don't do any kind of bad magic, dark magic, or anything like that. But again, it's for balance, it's that in-between balance. But they don't actually like it. They don't like it being practiced on a daily basis and things like that. So they're not into that, despite what people think they are not. There's a difference in magic that gets justice and magic that is not right. So the troll, throw, a throw, related to sort of a mischievous fae from the Orkney and Shetland Islands, I think. They are nocturnal, shy, small yet broad. Like the troll of Scandinavia, they sometimes can pass for humans. Some names associated with them is due to their appearance, such as trencher face, banner feet, bannock feet. That's because of the size of the feet, obviously, and the trencher face because they're said to be ugly. They're fond of music and will kidnap musicians. They come from earth-mound dwellings in the evening and will visit households as people sleep. The sylph, the air spirit, comes from the Latin sylvestris and nympha, used in the 16th century by Paracelsus to refer to any race of spirits inhabiting the air. Mortal, yet lacking a soul, because Paracelsus obviously he categorized the elemental beings: fire, salamanders, air, sylphs and nymphs, the earth, the gnomes, etc., and water is the undines. Sylphs usually heavily associate with woodland areas. The Labyrinthes, or philosophers, in the Magna Paracelsus says sylphs are rougher, coarser, and taller and stronger than humans. So it kind of does depend. Again, you have some people say they are tiny, but apparently they can actually be quite large, quite tall, quite strong. It's just that obviously we do not see them, so how would we know? That's what that says. Sylphs can be more closely related to humans. They move through the hair, so they are like free flowing. In fire, they would burn; in water, they would drown; and in earth, they get stuck. But they move freely through the air, is what they're saying, makes them alike to humans. There's discussion of sylphs in Alexander Pope's Rapé of Loch, which is 1717. In this, the Pope invents a theory to explain the self, saying that it is a mystically, chemically condensed human, possibly women, and it's whether they basically say that they're evil women's spirits that are full of dark vapours to ascend the skies. Yeah, so further yet, they're not exactly great. What it says here, are rejects of mankind, and they were freed from mortal laws. It says they assume what sexes and what shapes they please. They do guard the purity of maids when it comes to the good part of things. They're very courtly. They like midnight masquerades. They keep people safe from treacherous happenings, but they also find a friend and they will protect that friend as well. They're like a little daring spark. They can send little sparks into the air and you can see them, but that's on a lighter note. Like I say, the Pope puts it, they were just these really evil creatures or whatever. But on the other part of it, people believe that they're just generally just nice beings and they just don't trust humans like they used to, so they come across as maybe being, not as friendly, but that's not the case. They're also known to like the music and said to look somewhat like fireflies in some writings, but not all, that's just in some. They can give off, like I say, they give off little sparks and stuff. And they are known as the wise celestials in others as well. They are known as being very honourable beings to most people. Then we have the gnome, introduced by Paracelsus in the 16th century, and it was him that originally sort of invented it from the Latin gnomos, the earth dweller, and he describes them as, well, 2 spoons high, reluctant to interact with humans, able easy movement through earth, they live underground, they guard their treasures, and they don't really get along with many others, but they will be okay with goblins and dwarfs. But if they are to fight, they will also fight goblins and dwarfs. A figure of the 19th century fairy tales, I think it was Rudolph, put them with the goblins and dwarfs, losing the real earth association they have, but they're actually a completely separate being. The gnome, the goblins, and the dwarfs, they are all separate, they are not the same. So these writings say that's not fact, it's just what's said. So the imp, this is an offshoot or a cutting from the English noun impa, a young shoot. It later came to mean a child in general, and from the 16th century often used in expressions like imps, serpents of hell. By the 17th century, it meant small demons, which is familiar. In English and Celtic countries, all fae seemed to be recognised as demons, and the distinction between them was not clear. The impet from a fairy tale, Tom Tit Tot, like Rumpelstiltskin, has an imp in it. Not a very pleasant one either. I mean, most of them weren't. Anyway, they did change them all to be quite demonic. So the legend of the Imp King as well, that date back to 12th century Scotland and describes how the devil stole a child and placed an imp in the cradle. The imp returned to hell and started a revolution, calling all imps and hellhounds to fight for revenge. He called himself the Imp King. He grew a crown of horns. He led an army of demi-demons into the throne room of hell, where he was victorious. In reality, imps are mischievous rather than threatening. They are small but very lively. They do crave human attention, but they've also been long described as being bound to a sword or a crystal ball. Other times they were kept in objects summoned only when their masters needed them. So they could grant wishes as well, it is believed. Not all, but some could grant wishes in certain stories. The Tylwyth is the Middle Welsh for fair family, most common and usual word for fairies in Wales, but also the Bendithi Manal, blessing of the mothers, and I believe the Gorolen and the Ilion. The Tylwyth first appeared in a poem 14th century. Dafydd ap Gwilym, usually fair, but can be old as well and stunted and ugly. There's 5 general types of these beings. The Ilion are the elves, and the called now are said to be fays of the mines. The Babachad are household fae, and the I think it's Garaged and Wyn, female of the law, and the Gwalna Mountains, fays of the mountains or fays of the hills. So there's different kinds of them. Now the Elion, they inhabit groves and valleys, and they eat toadstools, and it says fay butter, and that's a type of fungus. They are the ones that wear the foxgloves, by the way, the ones that wear the little foxglove flowers. They will wear them, well, however, really, I suppose, however they want to use them. And we have the tooth fairy, which is obviously not real folklore, Northern Europe tradition of, yeah, it's not real, it's a tooth fairy. And it was that apparently when the first tooth was lost during Middle Ages, the superstition arose that children were to burn their baby teeth to save a child from hardship in the afterlife. Children who did not consign to burning their baby teeth were said to live a life of eternity, even in the afterlife, searching for them. It was really weird. The exchange of teeth was actually formed as well from witches exchanging baby teeth, not for money, but for the special connection of a child's fair connection, ensuring a bloodline, it would carry on through seer, ensuring that the bloodline would continue, and they could get a worthless piece of sort of anything really in replace with a tooth, but the connection was there, which is what was wanted. The baby tooth would be given to the fae to show the continuous bond, and then they would continue witches to give them teeth that had fallen regardless of what age they were, and the fae would make things from them. They would add them to weapons, bowls, things, anything really. Now, fairy godmother is nothing but a fairy tale. It's a godparent with magical powers. Earlier, though, it was believed to be an ancestral guardian or guidance from an ancestral guardian. Now it's like Cinderella's fairy godmother. But yet she has her roots in fates, Sleeping Beauty. That's another one that is associated with spinning, and female fae are very good at spinning, might I add. But in reality, they were nothing but the elders, the ancestors, the old seers that passed things on from generation to generation, and got turned into the fairy godmother for children and more pleasing stories. So yeah, that's that, guys. Sorry about the noises in the background, but obviously I do have dogs and they make noise. Thank you for listening.